Greetings everyone, it's me DJ, and I am back with another Historia Civilis video. Today we're going to be looking at the July Revolution. Last video we saw basically, the year without a summer, and what was going on in Europe post-Napoleonic Wars, and now we're going to specifically mainly focus on France this time, because that's what he was alluding to. And as we know, the French had several revolutions, not just the first. So it's gonna be cool to see France once again, going through it. And yeah, like I said, I know a lot about the first French Revolution. I was obsessed with it. Also, we learned about it at school. I don't know about all the subsequent revolutions after the first one, personally. But, yeah, I think that's what this video is gonna be about. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say other than we should probably just get to it, eh? So, I was warned that, with this video in particular, there's bias, especially from Historia Civilis, which makes sense, because I think Historia Civilis is unique. I like the guy, by the way. I don't want anyone to think I don't like this guy's content. I like watching his videos. I really do like Historia Civilis. I think the problem is that he's the only historical YouTuber I've been warned about from people who recommend him. Like, oh, there's bias. Like, be careful, there's bias, and yeah, like, he's the only one that I've been warned about. So I am going into this series, this video, as I do with all his other videos, with caution. You know what I mean? Because, again, like, how you feel about history or certain parts of history is up to you. I will at least say, though, I do think that, with historical YouTubers, it's probably best to remain as unbiased as possible. I mean, it's preferable, I'm gonna glaze up Kings and Generals, who is my favorite historical YouTuber, like with the Julius Caesar series. I really love that one. I was watching both Julius Caesar series at the same time last year. Historia Civilis and Kings and Generals, and, kind of comparing, contrasting them. What I liked a lot about Kings and Generals is that he would say something, but he would present all the other point of views, like with Caesar's assassination, or if Caesar was really a tyrant or a hero. Like, he would present multiple accounts, multiple points of view, without telling you how to feel. Meanwhile, Historia Civilis, on the other hand, did not like Julius Caesar, and it was evident. He did not like Octavian or Augustus, and again, like I said, obviously you can feel however you want, but I'm just saying, I think it's probably best for historical YouTubers to maybe try to present history in a neutral, unbiased lens. That's just my opinion, because I feel like you should with history, and let people decide for themselves, I suppose, that's just my opinion. I'm not sure if I'm gonna get flack for this. Like, I don't want anyone to think I'm attacking Historia Civilis. It's just, I've been warned a lot. He's the one historical YouTuber who I'm often warned by you guys to be wary of, and, it's a shame, but obviously that kind of skewers the back of my mind. I'm like, how is he gonna present this now? You know what I mean? Like I said, I think it's probably best for historical YouTubers, historians, to present history as unbiasedly as possible. I feel like you owe it, to listeners or people, because obviously some people might not watch all the other historical YouTubers. Like, for instance, I do, because that's like the channel, but like some people might only watch Historia Civilis videos, and this might be the only way they can learn about history, and if they have a biased version or perspective on things, it could really affect. I don't know. I hope you know what I'm saying. By the way, I love Historia Civilis. I'm going to be watching more of his videos, obviously, in this channel, but it is kind of a bit unfortunate that, everyone has to tell me to be careful when listening to him, So with that said, I'm going to come into this with a bit caution, like I did with Julius Caesar, but I'm still going to be trying to enjoy it. So let's get to it, shall we? Let's watch the July Revolution.
France, in the early 1820s, had done the impossible. They had reintegrated themselves back into the international system as a great power. But in 1823, that all changed. For some reason, France recklessly invaded Spain, which brought the great powers to the brink of war and almost took down the international system. Why did France get like 20% stupider in the 1820s? It's an important question, and to answer it, we will have to go back to where we left off with French politics. 1820, 3 years before France recklessly invaded Spain. The 1820s were when things really began to change in France, and it started when the nephew of the King of France was stabbed to death by a left-wing radical. This event sent shockwaves through French politics. The aristocracy and their allies in the French legislature, the ultra-conservatives, demanded immediate action. During the crisis, superstar politician Richelieu was brought back into government, and as prime minister, he pushed through a series of changes to the French electoral system. Up until now, the process had been that 1/5 of the legislators were elected every year, and the trend over the last 5 years had been that every year, the ultra-conservatives were losing ground to the centrists and the left-wing Republicans. With the assassination of the king's nephew, the ultra-conservatives were officially freaked out at the rise of the French left, and Richelieu was committed to stopping them from making any more electoral gains. Under the new system, 40% of the seats in the legislature would be elected by a select group of ultra-wealthy elites who were a lot more conservative and pro-monarchy than the general public. That was precisely the point. The people around the king were getting worried about the mood of the public, so they just insulated themselves from public opinion. They came from the maybe if I ignore my problems, they'll just go away school of
It never works, by the way. Oh man. It's like putting your head in the sand. It's like, yeah, it never works out, so. But again, we've seen it so many times in so many series, it's insane.
thought. They made elections a lot less frequent for the same reason. The thing about elections is that the more representative they are, the more stabilizing they are to the state. It forces governments to address problems early, before they become existential threats. It gives opposition groups something productive to do. Would you rather have angry opposition groups handing out leaflets, or stockpiling weapons? Which do you think is better for the long-term health of the state? But that only works if elections are fair. Without fair elections, groups are forced to get creative, and the probability of a rebellion, or a civil war, or a revolution increases. So France's electoral reforms in 1820 made the French state more brittle, and they did this to insulate the king and his preferred ultra-conservatives from their own growing unpopularity. In my opinion, it was a stupid thing to do. But the ultra-conservatives didn't see it as stupid. In the next election under this new rigged electoral system, the ultra-conservatives won 85% of the seats in the French legislature, absolutely dominating every other group that voiced any opposition to the king's will. The ultra-conservatives thought that they had pulled off a soft coup. They thought that they had won. But it was all an illusion. Even with 85% of the seats in the French legislature, the ultra-conservatives were still unpopular with the people. The electoral reforms didn't fix that fundamental problem. It only concealed it. In fact, they had sown the seeds of their own destruction.
Do you want to know where to invest $1,000?
With the huge ultra-conservative majority in the legislature, the centrist Prime Minister Richelieu was replaced by an extreme conservative named Villèle. And then a few years later, when the Spanish liberals rose up to remove their autocratic king from power, Villèle persuaded the King of France to invade. It's clear why Villèle felt threatened by this, right? He was trying to re-establish autocratic rule in his own country, and he feared the French liberals doing in France what the Spanish liberals were doing in Spain.
That is called force
Invading Spain was not wise, but Villèle was not thinking strategically. He was only thinking about his narrow political interests. Sharing a border with liberal Spain was not an existential threat to France. It did not require a military intervention, but it was politically inconvenient for France's ultra-conservative faction, so they invaded anyways. You'd think that the decision to invade a country for political reasons would spark a lively debate in the French legislature, but it didn't. The legislature was 85% ultra-conservative, and with the new rigged voting system, nobody in the government was particularly worried about the next election. Everybody just mindlessly went along with Villèle and the king. The fact that this dramatically increased the chance of a world war, a great power conflict, didn't bother any of them. That was far less important to them than their goofy ultra-conservative ideology. It's worth repeating that the French people were not on board with this. The ultra-conservatives had never been popular. They only dominated the legislature because the elections had been rigged to favor them. The people favored the liberals and the Republicans. The centrist liberals hated the invasion for obvious reasons. The Spanish liberals were their ideological brothers. The left-wing Republicans hated it too. The Spanish Constitution had been the invention of their beloved Emperor Napoleon. To the millions of Frenchmen who had at one time served under him, the thought of invading another country just to undo the work of Napoleon was unthinkable. But none of that opposition.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I feel like the fervor of the revolution, like, obviously everyone was sick of Napoleon by the end, mainly due to the constant wars, and the conscriptions, right? Napoleon kept, to be fair, it wasn't even really Napoleon's fault. The majority of the Napoleonic Wars was people declaring war on Napoleon because they hated him. But again, like, yeah, but, you know, obviously the war weariness, right? I think if there had been more peace in France, definitely, things would have been better. And the thing is, like, yeah, Napoleon, he ran France incredibly well. Like, when he first gained power, and he just went around fixing everything, no one can deny that Napoleon did a lot for the French, you know, especially in terms of just, yeah, his political reforms and whatnot. And it seems to me from all the sources I've read, the main issue a lot of people had with him was just the wars, the constant fighting, the constant war weariness. But then again, that wasn't completely all Napoleon's fault. Like, a lot of times he was playing defense, you know, in terms of people were declaring war on France and he just had to quickly end it. But, not to say he isn't at all responsible, I'm just saying, you know. But yeah, that makes sense when he puts it like that. Like, why would we want to undo? And also, it's just like the revolutionary fervor. Napoleon did a lot of good for France, and, you know, he governed well, and he really was a byproduct of the revolution, because this all started because the Bourbon monarchy was awful, and everyone really wanted things to change, and, you know, for the most part, a lot of Napoleon's reforms, I think, for the French were pretty, you know, seen well and beneficial, so it makes sense, like, you know, you'd want to keep that up. And also, it's kind of like, yeah, when people were tired of Napoleon near the end of his reign, still a lot of people did really like the guy, you know, love him, and I think they realized, you could see that how good he was at governing when at his absence, right? Because, like, he's replaced by this new Louis, and from what I've heard, he isn't the greatest ruler. The fact there's a revolution right now, it's telling me he's not the greatest ruler. So it's kind of like, oh, you know what? Things might have not all been perfect under Napoleon, mainly the constant wars. But for the most part, he was pretty alright. Like, you know, that's what I imagine what the French would be thinking, right? So it's like you kind of miss what you had, right?
Position mattered. The invasion of Spain went ahead anyways, and in the next French election, 96% of the seats went to the ultra-conservatives. Now, there was virtually no domestic political opposition to whatever Villèle and the King of France wanted to do. But I'll say it again, there was plenty of opposition out on the streets. It's just that the political system had been designed so that none of those people were allowed to participate in politics anymore. Shortly after this, King Louis XVIII, the man who had been restored to the throne after the fall of Napoleon, died. He was succeeded by his younger brother, a much more autocratic and conservative man who took the name of Charles X. Under King Charles and his ultra-conservative Prime Minister Villèle, liberals and Republicans working within the government were purged. Purged is such a heavy word. They were fired. They weren't killed. Villèle then began to systematically roll back the reforms of the French Revolution in an effort to return France to an 18th century political mindset.
Yeah, that's the problem we covered last video with what the King of Spain was trying to do. Let's go back to how things were before Napoleon. But whether you like him or hate him, Napoleon changed the world. For better or for worse, I'll leave that to you. But, point is, like, things are not the same. Things will never be the same, after what happened with the First French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, like, a lot of call for constitutions, a restriction of monarchy's powers, like, things have changed. There's no going back, like, you have to kind of make do with what you have now. And again, this is a precarious situation for the monarchy. I can see their perspective on it. Like, obviously, you don't want to completely go all for the Republicans because they just completely want what the French Revolution to keep going. They want the monarchy gone. But I think what Louis did last video, kind of supporting the middle ground, the liberals, probably the best and most realistic situation he could do without causing too much issues, but apparently he rolled back on that and went full-on conservative, so, I can understand where the monarchy's coming from, but it's like you have to adapt or die, because, like, things will never fully be what they once were, especially in this post-revolution Napoleonic world.
The previous king had promised to never do this, and that promise had kept the peace in France for the last 9 years. The new king did not feel bound by that promise. Bear in mind that none of these moves were popular, and the people weren't afraid to let him know.
You have to think about why the first revolution happened, right? People were not happy with the way that Louis was running things, how indifferent he was, how he had his hand in the sand, if it were, his incompetence of ruling. If you're a monarch, maybe you could get away with being a bit tyrannical. You can get away with kind of being a bit, like, incompetent. Maybe you might even go your entire reign. But eventually, the thing is that the resentment's gonna build up. And eventually, like, even if it doesn't happen in your lifetime, people are gonna get tired of you, whether it be your incompetence or your tyranny, or feel like you're kicking them in the face, And eventually, like, a revolution just happens, eventually people are gonna get sick, right? If you mistreat them enough. And that's the thing with, like, leaders and monarchs I've noticed. Like, yeah, we often think of the absolute power aspect, especially with absolute monarchies. Like, I have all the power, I'm calling all the shots. But in a way, if you upset the people enough, if they turn on you, you can see just how you lose the grip, right? Like, you think of, like, Tsar Nicholas, or, like, many more examples of monarchies who kind of upset the people enough to the point the people turned on them and actually could straight up either imprison or just murder them if they're frenzied enough. So in a way, like, you can only get away with this for so long, upsetting your the people you rule over before eventually the dog bites back, I think it's the saying, right? And like you would think with like Charles would have seen, maybe upsetting the people isn't a good idea. Like, you know, like think of what they can do. Like think of the first revolution, right? That should be on the mind of all these Bourbon monarch kings. Like, remember the people, if they want, they can go against you, and you can be replaced and removed, or worst case scenario, murdered. So I think it really is the duty of kings to get the people to like you, to get the people to respect you. At I would say fear, but I feel like fear in the long run doesn't always work in the long run. Like, getting the people on your side and their good grace, it's kind of like when you're saying if you lose the people and the army, you lose everything, right? Like the king is just powerless from then on. So again, like you got to keep these in mind, dude.
The outcry reached a fever pitch, and in order to insulate the government from any further criticism, Villèle clamped down on the liberal press with heavy censorship laws. Again, maybe if I ignore my problems, they'll just go away. It soon became clear that the new king had a pretty old-fashioned attitude when it came to his prime minister. At the beginning of each year, the king gave Villèle a list of priorities, and it was Villèle's job throughout the year to simply make everything on that list a law. It was like the king was his own prime minister, and Villèle was his little assistant or something. Under such a system, it's not clear what the purpose of elections would even be. There's not really any point if the king's just gonna personally dominate the legislature no matter what. I frankly don't understand why Villèle tolerated being humiliated in this way, but I guess it was the logical conclusion of his extreme ultra-conservative ideology. One of the things that the king ordered Villèle to do was compensate the aristocracy for the loss of their land during the revolution. The land was long gone, so what Villèle had to do was pay the rich by taxing the poor. It was exactly as popular with the people as you might imagine.
Yeah, taxation. Like you see with revolutions, there's a lot of trends, guys. All revolutions have trends that accompany them, and taxation seems to be one of them. Like, like taxing the people, and who likes taxes, right? But that's kind of a part of the first revolution, right? People were being taxed. And then I also think like the American Revolution here, and taxation without representation. You know what I mean? Like it's a trend, you notice, that one of the many trends, upsetting the people, ignoring them, not addressing their concerns or their issues, taxing them. Like, they say those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and all of history is us just repeating. Humans just keep repeating crap, like, but I think that should go incredibly... That saying, more than anything, should frighten people who are in power, or people who are in high status, because it's like, yeah, especially with kings, we have all of human history to see incompetent kings and what exactly led to their downfalls. And you think, looking at all this, it makes me amazed how Napoleon governed. Napoleon was like kind of like, I think I've heard said he was kind of like a low nobility, but for the most part in practice, he wasn't anything special before he took power or, made his name. And like I said, I've always been amazed at someone like Napoleon who wasn't like high nobility. I don't know. I know he went to military school, but like in terms of education, surely he wouldn't have been more provided for that area than like the aristocracy, right? Or like the royal family. Surely the royal family would have a greater access to like education, right? For future, for stuff. So, like, it's kind of just amazing Napoleon could govern so well, It's like, what was he learning? I often wonder. What books was Napoleon reading that, you know, to like freaking be a great ruler and governor of France? Like, you know, maybe Charles should be reading those books, you know? Whatever Napoleon was reading, it must have been good. But then again, it's more than just that. It's like execution and intelligence, and Napoleon was really good. Was really smart. I'm sorry, I keep talking about Napoleon, but we are in France, you know.
The new taxes weren't even sufficient, so France had to plunge itself deeply into debt in order to finance this scheme. And for what? Just to re-establish the supremacy of the French aristocracy. The country was politically unstable, and the poor were still struggling to find enough to eat. The king's political instincts were all out of whack. An actual election would have helped the king to refocus on what was actually important. But he didn't care about actual elections. As the years passed, the king and Villèle continued their politically unpopular ultra-conservative crusade, which had the unintended, but in my opinion, obvious side effect of making France incredibly politically unstable. In 1827, as the king was performing a routine inspection of the Paris National Guard, the guardsmen surprised him with impromptu cries of "Down with Villèle." When officers tried to establish order, one guardsman decided to go down in history as an absolute legend, and punched his superior officer in the face, right in front of the king. Pretty soon, the officers completely lost control of the men. They were unable to stop another guardsman from breaking ranks and screaming treasonous stuff right in the king's face. It was a wake-up call for the ultra-conservatives.
Wow.
The next day, Villèle's government disbanded the Paris National Guard. The backlash was here, and even the rank and file in the military were coming out.
I love his solution to every problem is to remove it. He's like, the press, remove it. These people in, you know, the government, remove them. You know, the liberals and Republicans. Freaking the National Guard's getting uppity, remove them. You can't just keep removing things. You can't just keep throwing them away. It's like the issue is still there. I don't know why. It just keeps going. Like, if they could, they would just remove everything. Like, oh, the people are all upset. Remove them all. Like, you know, deport everyone from France. Have no one in the country. Then everything will be okay. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking like that. That's just funny to me.
Openly against the king. Villèle thought that this might just be the beginning of a period of unpopularity for the government, and so he advised the king to call an early election so that they could lock in their legislative majority for the next 7 years. Yes, they had been working tirelessly this entire time to make elections as infrequent as possible. When we started this story, there was an election every year. Now there was an election every 7 years. If he locked in a legislative majority now, Villèle hoped that all of his autocratic reforms would be done within the next 7 years. And after that, maybe he wouldn't have to worry about elections at all anymore. The liberal and Republican opposition groups saw this as an existential crisis. They feared that in 7 years' time, this may all be gone, and that this may literally be the last French election. The electoral system was still rigged against the opposition, but nevertheless, the liberals and the Republicans threw every resource they had into rallying public opinion and coming out in force. Here were the results of the 1827 French election. 46% of the seats went to a coalition of liberal and Republican opposition groups. 45% of the seats went to Villèle's ultra-conservative government coalition. 7% of the seats went to a conservative group that opposed Villèle's government. Even under the rigged electoral system, the liberal opposition groups unexpectedly won the most seats. They were ecstatic.
Wow.
The king
That's amazing.
and Villèle had made a historic blunder. To make matters worse, it quickly became clear that all of these groups hated each other, and so nobody was able to put together a governing majority. The The king was now stuck with a deadlocked legislature for the next 7 years. The king fired Villèle and selected a new ultra-conservative prime minister who believed that they could find compromises with the liberals. But the liberals and the other opposition groups were high on their electoral victory and out for blood, so none of them would agree to work with any ultra-conservative prime minister. If the king really wanted to work with the liberals, then he should select a liberal prime minister. But he didn't. Over the next year and a half, the legislature accomplished virtually nothing. Eventually, the king grew frustrated and fired his failed compromise prime minister in favor of somebody who actually shared his politics. In 1829, he appointed an extreme right-wing ultra-conservative named Polignac as prime minister. If a compromise ultra-conservative couldn't figure out how to pass anything in the legislature, then an extreme ultra-conservative definitely wouldn't either. But the king...
Yeah, this is escalating, man. Like I said, like, you just see the trends of everything that's going wrong. And, you know, another bottle of water. But, you know what I mean? Like, now he's doubling down, right? Like, that's what he's been trying to do, obviously. Try to get more power for the freaking monarchy. He's doubling down, but the thing is, like, he's not addressing any of the problems. And... yeah, it's just like a complete mess, you know?
King no longer cared. He just wanted somebody who shared his views to start pushing people around. Just to give you a sense of how extreme this new prime minister was, during the Napoleonic Wars, he was implicated in an attempt to assassinate the emperor and was imprisoned for 9 years. After the king was restored to the throne, Polignac's political right-hand man argued for rounding up Napoleon's supporters and putting them to death. The liberal opposition groups and
yeah, already the Republicans won't like him, and the liberals too, just completely... this man's unhinged. Like... wow.
And in particular, their Republican allies were justifiably alarmed that the king would allow men like this to get anywhere near government.
It's true though, like, you know, having someone who was known to try to commit an assassination, in the previous government, and then, like, freaking calling for the purging, I'm assuming the murder of Napoleonic supporters, like, someone like that in a high governmental position does not speak confidence. Seems like someone out trigger happy, you know what I mean? Out for blood. So this would be incredibly alarming, especially to the Republicans who, you know, miss Napoleon, so yeah.
In addition to all of this, the king was sending an undeniable signal with this appointment. He was signaling that it did not particularly matter what the results of the election were, since he was perfectly comfortable running everything through his unelected and unrepresentative prime minister. Perhaps a taste of what the future of France may look like. Around this time, King Charles decided to invade Algeria. He had some pretext for this, but the pretext doesn't really matter. The real reason is that France lost virtually all of its colonies after its defeat at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the king felt that establishing a new colony in Algeria would restore French prestige. I would just ask you, is this a good reason to establish a colony? What would our beloved George Canning say about this? Canning had argued that colonies were only useful insofar.
Oh, is Canning's dead already? At this point? Aw. I hope... RIP. He was my favorite person last video, you know? But yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, Canning was basically like, hey, no... I think he was really trying to curb European powers from expanding, right? That was a huge part of it. I mean, granted, we addressed, at least with the continent of America through South and Central America, how he essentially kind of secured that place from European powers going there and, you know, colonizing So, yeah, again, Britain's like put its foot down last video. So I'm like wondering what they think of any of this, considering the king wants to go and colonize somewhere like Algeria.
As they facilitated trade. I don't recall him saying anything about making the king feel better about past humiliations. You will
Yeah, it kind of comes across as ego, right? Like, oh, to restore French prestige, like, mainly just to look, I guess just for appearance and ego. There doesn't seem to be the pretext of trade or something beneficial or pragmatic, you know, from any of this.
see this argument made time and time again by mediocre men in the 19th century. They will become obsessed with how colonies look on a map, and then will use the map to justify the policy. But the point of colonies cannot be how they look on a map. The map is an abstraction, a theoretical tool. They're not real. What's real is conditions on the ground. What would the invasion of Algeria do to improve the material conditions in France? Nothing. In fact, it was worse than nothing. France would have to send 20% of its army overseas. It was France's second unnecessary invasion in only 7 years. It destroyed France's military readiness for basically no reason. If there was a crisis in Europe, France would find it difficult to respond. It was a risky plan. Furthermore, France didn't really have any money, and this invasion would impose a massive financial burden. Remember, France was still taxing the poor so that they could give money to the rich. Any additional taxes to finance this reckless invasion would be met with hostility. But King Charles and Prime Minister Polignac wanted to do it, and so they just did it. In 1830, the king opened that year's deadlocked legislature by proposing a relatively modest set of programs. But many politicians found the way that he opened the session alarming. He seemed to subtly threaten violence if any of them stood in the way of his legislation. He even hinted that he may act without the approval of the legislature, if necessary, describing himself as the true representative of the people, not the elected legislature.
Oh boy.
It was a real mask-off moment for the king. Even the king's own ultra-conservatives were bothered.
Yeah, it seems like mask off is the appropriate way to put it, Historia Civilis. It does come across, huh, like, alright, let's drop the act. Here's what's gonna happen. Like, you know, it comes across like that, right? Like, he's dropping the act, he's dropping the formality, if you would, and just being honest. I mean, we've kind of seen it, it's been like this the whole time. He's just being straight up about it now. Kind of almost daring, what are you gonna do about it, you know? And as we know, I'm imagining they're gonna do something about it. It's about to go wild, I imagine.
A couple of weeks later, the Liberal opposition in the legislature were able to gather enough support to push back against the king. They sent a letter to the king and told him that from now on, the king's ministers, including the prime minister, must have the support of the legislature. The king couldn't just appoint whomever he wished. Elections had to mean something. King Charles was incensed by what he perceived to be a direct challenge to his power. He accused the liberals of trying to overthrow the government. He decided that he could not work with these people, and immediately dissolved the legislature and called a new election. According to his own electoral reforms, this was 4 years ahead of schedule, but given the current political climate, the liberal opposition was likely to get stronger in the short term, not weaker. And so he thought that he would need a friendly legislature to get him through the coming storm. Elections were scheduled to begin in late June. The date was not an accident. The French army was scheduled to land in Algeria in early June, so the thought was that by the end of the month, there would probably be some good news to bolster support for the ultra-conservatives. One politician begged Prime Minister Polignac to keep the legislature in session all the way up until the election, because he believed that he could cobble together a small working majority of moderates from different factions. Polignac responded, "A majority? That would really cause me problems. I wouldn't know what to do with it." Kind of a shocking thing for a politician to say out loud, but it really shows how Polignac and the king weren't really interested in liberal democracy at all. The ultra-conservative faction was really lost at sea at this point. They only cared about investing more and more power into the king and the aristocracy, and very little about any other people or institutions. Polignac wasn't even particularly interested in popular support. What he wanted to do.
There's no compromise, it's what I'm getting. There's no desire to compromise or hear anyone out, hear a different point of view, meet a perspective, and kind of like collaborate, you know? It's, we want what we want. F you if you don't agree. You know what I mean? Like, there's not even trying to be compromise. There's no, I guess, diplomacy, trying to find a common ground or come to like a majority agreement. It's just, you know, we want what we want, like, and we're gonna get it, and we're gonna take it. So that's a huge problem, I think, in government. I mean, granted, I don't know, I don't work in government at all, I'm not involved with it, but I imagine you would have to, like, compromise. I imagine there's a lot of compromises you have to do when you're running a nation. It's not just with foreign powers, but with, like, your own self, you know? And I many years ago, I did this little test in one of my classes where we had to negotiate. And I remember, like, a lawyer came to our class and basically gave us these list of, like, demands, what our clients want, etc. And, like, we were paired off in group in, like, you know, obviously two of us were paired. And I was paired with this guy, and we both had a set of different demands regarding one issue. And, like, we had to come to common ground. Alright, first of all, we know that not one of us is gonna get everything we want. Like, some of what we want contradicts what someone else's wants, so we had to come to this idea of, okay, neither one of us is gonna get everything we want, but what is the best way to come to agreement so we can at least get something? You know what I mean? Like, I don't think anyone's ever gonna truly walk out happy or with everything they want, but, like, you just have to compromise and take what you can, you know? And that little thing taught me about that, and that's kind of how, like, I imagine life works, like, you know? So, like, you can't just be like, I want what I want, like, you know, like, you know what I mean, right? I'm sorry, I'm rambling so much in this video for some reason, but mindset like these guys have, I don't think works in the long run. But that's just what I'm guessing, you know?
Was make elections no longer matter. We must now talk about Article 14 of France's Constitution, also known as the Charter. History will hang on the wording of Article 14, so let me just give you the whole thing up front. The king is the supreme head of state, commands the land and the sea forces, declares war, makes treaties of peace, alliances, and commerce, appoints to all places of public administration, and makes the necessary regulations and ordinances for the execution of the laws and the security of the state. Let's break it down. The king is the head of the state, he commands the military, runs foreign policy, and appoints all the ministers. That's all very straightforward. But then, there's this funny bit at the end. And makes the necessary regulations and ordinances for the execution of the laws and the security of the state. Regulations and ordinances. That basically means laws, right? And makes the necessary laws for the security of the state. Huh. You see what this is, don't you? If the king pressed a giant red button that said, "This is a security matter," he could institute any regulation or law that he wished. Who got to decide what was a security matter? The king. It was a giant loophole in the middle of the French Constitution that could theoretically grant the king unlimited power in the name of security. The king's supporters, in the ultra-conservatives, began to argue that the
Yeah, that giant loophole. It's all about the wording, man. Like, so much of, like, laws and stuff, like, you have to really have, like, an eye for the wording. Because one word, one little phrase out of line, everything, like, anyone can exploit it if they're smart enough, right? Like, you need to be airtight with that crap. So the king basically, if he decides just randomly something is a security matter, he can just do whatever he wants. Like, wow.
The unruly liberal opposition to the king was a security matter, and if the upcoming election tipped in the liberal direction, the king could use Article 14 to overturn it. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. Even the ultra-conservatives were split on whether it would even be legal. But the ultra-conservatives didn't need to agree. Only the king needed to agree. After some consideration, the king spoke to his closest ministers. If the upcoming election results were not to his liking, he said, then he would, quote, make his prerogative respected. The king was not being explicit, but everybody
My lord, is that legal? I will make it legal. Like, friggin' Star Wars. I'm sorry, I was thinking about Star Wars. I really like Star Wars. I know everyone hates the prequels, and I like it because I grew up with the Star Wars prequels. You know, I was born in the year 2000. I basically grew up watching the prequels and loving them, and I still do love them. And a part of it I like is watching Emperor Palpatine gain power, and the way he goes about it. Like, I know everyone's like, oh, the politics of the prequel suck, but like, I don't know. Like, I really liked it. Like, you kind of see some quotes like that kind of like ring in my head, or like, this is how democracy dies with thunderous applause. Like, I don't know. There are some lines I know that have been memed and kind of laughed about, but like, I don't know, I could apply to actual history, like, stuff like this, you know? I'm sorry, let's get back to this.
Took his meaning. One way or another, the liberal opposition would be out of power after the next election. The French army landed in Algeria in early June, and 10 days later they won their first significant victory. All according to plan. On the day that the news of the French victory reached Paris, the king decided to make a big public spectacle of attending mass, you know, to beef up his religious credibility on the...
Of course. I can't believe they actually went with the Algeria thing, but, you know, like, again, like, I think what you mentioned earlier about colonialism is starting, it does resonate with me, like, caning just like, okay, the more important thing is trade, you know, the colonialism aspect is something else, like, you can distinguish the two. And again, like, yeah, it does look nice having a lot of territory on a world map. Like, if you look at the British Empire at its peak, right, like, how much of the world was under their grasp, it looks really nice on a map, but there has to be some type of pragmatic sense to taking a territory, right? To, like, a colonialism and whatnot. And I'm sure, like, I hope it's not completely just, oh, for an ego boost. Like, I hope there's a pragmatic sense of, you know, something to gain from Algeria itself, you know? I don't know. Okay, maybe there is, maybe it is as straightforward as it says, just for an ego boost to look nice on a map. If so, that's just a waste of, like, power, right, and resource that could be more effectively used elsewhere.
Eve of the election. As expected, large crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the king as he made his way through the streets. But there was no cheering, no waving. The crowds just stood there, eerily silent, watching the king like a pack of hungry wolves.
Holy crap, that's terrifying.
Voting began shortly after this, and then wrapped up in the third week of July. The feeling going into the election was that it might be close. It wasn't close. 65% of the legislative seats went to the Liberal and Republican opposition. 32% of the seats went to the king's ultra-conservatives. The rest went to smaller groups that also opposed Polignac's government. A massive victory for the Liberals. The king and his ultra-conservative allies met to decide what to do about the election results. Discussion centered around Article 14 of the Charter. If they argued that the Liberals in the legislature were a semi-treasonous faction, then the king had the authority under Article 14 of the Charter to make the necessary laws for the security of the state. After much debate, the king decided to invoke Article 14 and use it to do 4 things. These would later become known as the 4 ordinances. 1. Dissolve the newly elected Liberal majority legislature. 2. Reform the French electoral system and make it pretty much impossible for the Liberals to ever win again. 3. Immediately hold new elections under this new electoral system and allow the ultra-conservatives to win pretty much every seat. 4. Suspend freedom of the press and shut down the liberal newspapers, who the king blamed for his drop in popularity and the unexpected election results. That's right, it was the newspapers' fault, not the 10 years of unpopular policy.
Okay, and you see this with, like, modern politicians and governments, like, often trying to defer blame on anything except themselves. Like, it's the newspapers, it's their fault, like, you know, it's YouTube's fault, it's Twitter's fault, I don't know, like, I don't know. It's just like, some things never change, right? Like, I feel like when you look at stuff like this, like, some things never change in history, and it's just like, it happens, and you just see the trends, especially, like, as I've watched so many history videos, like, you just pick up on the trends. It's like, oh, I see where this is going. I'm seeing why this is happening, you know? It should be, like, mandatory for, like, leaders and, like, I don't know, like monarchs, right? To, like, learn so much history. Even if you think it's boring, you have to see, okay, what did this king do that angered everyone and made everyone turn on them? Like, I feel like that should be, like, entire lessons devoted to, like, okay, why did everyone turn on this guy? Well, you see, he pissed off the people, and he kept antagonizing everyone, like, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's important. Either that, or maybe they did have classes like that, they just completely zoned out. I don't know. But man, like, it should. Like, we really, at some points, really need to relearn from history, right? Like, history, if learned from, it's really so important, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not given as much emphasis as other subjects such as science and math, I feel, but it's really important to learn from it, guys, like, you know what I mean? Like, you can, how do you say this? You can learn a lot from it, and you can avoid a lot of mistakes if you learn from it, you know? And, like, see what works and what doesn't. I don't know. I think history is a very underrated subject. Especially in the educational system.
The king's cousin, Louis-Philippe, was not informed that the king was taking this step. He learned of the 4 ordinances by reading about it in the newspaper. Louis-Philippe was more friendly to the liberals than his cousin the king was, and when he read what the king had done, he told his wife, "They've done it. They've mounted a coup d'etat." Later that day, he hosted a large group of mostly liberal supporters at his home, and quite naturally, the king's 4 ordinances were all anybody could talk about. In front of all these people, the usually careful Louis-Philippe lost his composure and shouted, "They're mad! They'll get themselves exiled again!" His liberal supporters urged him to come to Paris and throw his support behind the liberal opposition. Louis-Philippe told them no. He wouldn't openly go against the king. For the time being, he would do nothing.
Okay, a new player has arrived, Louis-Philippe. Like I said, I don't know anything about this, guys. I'm completely ignorant and blind, so But he seems like he's gonna be used, right? Like, I imagine if the liberals are put, this is just a prediction, I could be completely wrong. Like I said, I don't know anything what's gonna happen, but I imagine the liberals are gonna do something, like a revolution. I'm implies something's gonna happen. I don't know if there's gonna be a full-on, like, mob or killing or whatnot, but something big is about to happen, and I imagine the liberals, Republicans are about to make a big move against the king, and having a relative of the king who's friendly with you seems like you could use that for your advantage, right? Like, maybe get him to replace the king, or like maybe make him your puppet. Like, maybe puppet's a bit wrong, I don't know, but like, you know, I feel like Louis-Philippe is now going to be used for a big thing. Watch him not appear for the rest of the video. That'd be hilarious. Sometimes I get afraid of my predictions, or like trying to predict, because I'm like, I'll be completely off base and I'll be like, oh, like, oh, never mind, forget what I said. Alright, let's see if Louis-Philippe becomes a big time player though.
In Paris, the liberal newspapers were not taking this lying down. One paper famously wrote, "The legal regime is now interrupted. That of force has begun. In this situation, obedience ceases to be a duty." Later continuing, "France must judge how far it ought to take its resistance." They were coming just a hair shy of openly calling for revolution. That evening, soldiers tried to shut down one of the many liberal newspapers that were continuing to operate in violation of the king's new censorship law.
You know what's funny about all this? Is that you think of the Spanish situation from last video, The Year Without a Summer. And yeah, essentially, it's the exact same thing. The Spanish king, you know, went against the liberals, right? They had their liberal constitution. They liked it. He then proceeded to try to remove as much power as he could from them so that, you know, Spain can go back to how it was in the 18th century. The people pushed back. The king got deposed. And, again, if it wasn't for the French just forcefully putting him back on, he may not have gained power back. You know, so it seems like literally the exact same thing is happening here in France, right? You think like an event, even that close, like you would see the parallels, right? But no.
This attracted a crowd who began taunting the soldiers with cries of "Down with the Bourbons" and "Long live the Charter." The soldiers tried to suppress the crowd, but it quickly turned into a riot, with mobs roaming the streets and smashing street lamps. By pure chance, one of these mobs stumbled across Prime Minister Polignac and his Minister of the Navy as they were leaving a cabinet meeting. The mob closed in and started pelting the two with rocks. The politicians narrowly escaped the mob by jumping into a nearby carriage, but not before the Minister of the Navy was badly injured. Somehow, the French Navy managed to lose a battle on the streets of Paris. They really weren't safe anywhere.
Okay, that was a good one.
Love our legendary subs, so you'll love our legendary new Doritos.
On July 27th, thousands of soldiers were sent to shut down the liberal opposition newspapers, which led to widespread protests across Paris. First, the soldiers tried to escalate things by charging one of the crowds on horseback, which didn't work. Later, they tried to escalate further by firing indiscriminately into the crowd. 21 were killed and scores were wounded. As the sun went down on a violent day, some new revolutionary slogans were heard in the protests. "Down with the aristocrats! Death to the ministers!" Only 24 hours ago, these had been liberal crowds who had been protesting for constitutionalism and a free press. Now they were revolutionary crowds, and they wanted to overthrow the government.
Again, like when we covered last video about the situation in Spain, you know, that's the thing. It's like eventually when the king shows himself to be so uncompromising and unwilling to even listen to a different perspective, that just leads to people to see this man can't be reasoned with. if words and like protest won't get through to him, only violence can amend the situation, you know? And it seems like we're getting to that point where the people are seeing, okay, the king ain't listening. We need to get rid of him, you know what I mean? And again, that's like a trend with all revolutions leading up. Like, eventually, if you don't compromise enough, it's all gonna end with violence, right?
The violence had only radicalized the people. The next day, the crowds were significantly larger. The man in charge of defending Paris at this time was Major General Marmont, and he had a hell of a problem on his hands.
Hey, Marmont, good to see you, my bro. I've always kind of been sympathetic towards Marmont. He's by no means my favorite marshal. I wouldn't even put him in my top 5, but like I always kind of felt bad for him, mainly because Napoleon completely completely dissed him when he made him a marshal. Mister, I'm giving you this position, but you don't deserve it. Like, I'll never get over Napoleon. Like, Napoleon being such a jerk to everyone. It's the funniest thing ever. That's how he treats his friends, and I kind of feel bad. You know? Either way, I always been sympathetic towards Marmont. Even his surrender of Paris, I think, was a good move. Because, like, if Napoleon had his way, Paris would have been bombarded. Like, Marmont giving it up in a really hopeless situation, in a situation that victory was, at that point, impossible to achieve over the coalition. Like, just a sound move, like, save the city, right? Like, again, I have a non-negative view towards Marmont. An almost understanding one.
His garrison in Paris had been hollowed out for the Algerian campaign, and of those that remained, most of the higher-ranking officers had been sent home so that they could vote for the ultra-conservatives in the upcoming election. Marmont's garrison was not in any way prepared for what they were about to encounter. At noon, Marmont moved into Paris with the aim of occupying key bridges and public squares, where the protests had been the strongest. What they found when they entered the city was totally unexpected. Within the last 24 hours, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars had grabbed their dusty old muskets and gone over to help the protesters. The veterans had each adopted large groups of protesters, and in only a day, they taught them a few tricks. As Marmont's soldiers advanced through the streets, they ran into thousands, yes, thousands.
That's insane. Frickin' the Napoleonic veterans are out here. And that makes sense, though. Like, Napoleon's army was, you know, like, really a product of the revolution itself. They fought for Napoleon, and Napoleon was beloved by his veterans. He was beloved by his army, you know, because of how much of a Giga Chad general he was. And I can only imagine how they felt after Napoleon was kicked out, and then having to not only lose their beloved commander, general, emperor, but then having to now serve. I know some definitely probably didn't, like, just retired, didn't want to serve the Bourbon monarchy, but to those who just completely left, like, thinking about the glorious time they had under Napoleon, when things were more prosperous, when things were going much better, minus all the constant wars, and, you know, yeah, like, obviously they fought for the revolution, they fought for Napoleon, they fought, you know, and died and suffered for over 20 years of war, only for everything to go back to the Bourbon monarchy. Like, you could imagine a lot of resentment, right? Building from that. I know I'd be angry, like, if I fought for the revolution, served under the great Napoleon, and then just for all that to have completely crumbled. Like, the radicals offer we can continue with the revolution, continue with what we originally all fought for, you know? So, the veterans are now here, helping whatever they can. Like, yeah, you could just, that makes sense. So that's completely dangerous to the situation, because, like, what are you teaching them? How to fight? Like, from the great minds of the Napoleonic era who went through it? That's dangerous. That would only make this... If this comes to blows, that just makes it even more dangerous dealing with them. Oh boy.
Of barricades. These were tall defensive structures built out of ripped up cobblestones and furniture and wagons and parts of buildings and anything else that the protesters could get their hands on. The taller ones could be 3 meters high, which for the Americans in the audience is approximately learn how long a meter is high. Quite high.
You guys ever see the musical Les Miserables? I know I'm not pronouncing that, guys, but you know, like, I think one of the big set pieces is, like, the barricades, you know what I mean? Like, it kind of reminded me of that. I know that the musical takes place during one of the revolutions past Napoleon. But then again, France had several revolutions, so I'm not sure which one it is. But, you know, it just kind of reminded me, like, the image of the barricades as the revolutionaries fight. It really is a poignant image, you know what I mean? Like, picture in the head.
The old veterans instructed the protesters not only to build the barricades, but also to occupy the buildings on each side of the streets approaching the barricades, so that any enemy soldiers would be hit with musket fire from 3 directions.
Holy crap, they're bringing their tactics into this. They're like, here, let's help. Let's give them tactical advice and things. Again, this makes them more dangerous, though, and like, if a conflict happens, the people are learning firsthand from Napoleon's veteran men, which makes them even more dangerous, you know what I mean?
They also loaded up the buildings with cobblestones and roof tiles and other things that unarmed protesters could hurl down at the soldiers. Let's not be cute. By other things, I mean human excrement.
Oh.
As groups of soldiers advanced into the city, they bumped into barricades that hadn't been there last night. When they turned around, they bumped into new barricades that hadn't been there a few hours earlier. It was like being trapped in a maze, but the walls kept shifting, and also somebody kept dumping human excrement into it. Marmont had not thought to send his soldiers into the city with supplies, and so the whole garrison spent 8 or more hours covered in filth, frantically marching in circles with no food or water. Morale was at an all-time low. A great many soldiers either surrendered to the protesters or defected to join their cause. As the sun began to set,
Yeah, again, Marmont is undersupplied, undermanned, obviously. But also this, like, he can't blame him for not expecting this to go the way it did, right? Like, but man, a defeat for the most part, right? He's just been defeated. And it was all positioning, too. They built barricades and just managed to wear them out, like, a war of attrition, if you would. All positioning, guys. Positioning can win you battles. Julius Caesar taught me that, you know?
Many of the soldiers had to make direct assaults on the barricades just to escape the city and make it back to camp. Late in the day, the liberal opposition opened negotiations with Marmont. They told him that as a precondition to any talks, the king must revoke the 4 ordinances. Marmont expressed his sympathy and agreed to take their demand directly to Prime Minister Polignac. The Prime Minister flatly rejected this preliminary demand and told Marmont that there would not be any further meetings with the delegates. Marmont was stunned at his response and decided to take the highly unorthodox step of writing to the king personally. He wrote, "This is no longer a riot, it is a revolution." Continuing, "I think it is urgent that your majesty profit without delay from the overtures that are made to him. The honor of the crown can still be saved. Tomorrow, perhaps it will be too late. I am taking measures to pacify the revolt. The troops will be ready at noon, but I await with impatience your majesty's orders." To be clear, this was way out of line. This was a local military officer going around the prime minister so that he could advise the king on political matters. But
I don't know about that. That's a bit harsh. Like, Marmont was a marshal. Like, that was isn't that the highest position one could gain in the... I know that was under Napoleon's rule, obviously, and the king probably doesn't want to acknowledge Napoleon's rule, but you know what I mean. He made a name for himself, is all I'm saying, and someone who was there during the restoration of the monarchy, remained loyal even I think during the 100 days, helped surrender Paris to the coalition. Like, Marmont ain't just a nobody. He's a name, an established one. So I don't know. That was just a small
But
tangent.
Marmont was desperate, and nobody above him seemed to be taking the situation seriously. The king wrote back and basically told Marmont to hold steady. Marmont's pleas had fallen on deaf ears.
Why be just a health coach when you can become a licensed?
The next morning, Marmont pulled back to a defensive position. He wouldn't be tricked into another costly engagement like yesterday. Almost immediately, 15 or 20% of Marmont's 12,000 soldiers defected and went over to join the protesters. In order to fill the holes in his defensive position, Marmont ordered his men to pull back into an even tighter circle, which the soldiers incorrectly interpreted as a retreat, which triggered a chain reaction of even more defections. By noon, the defections were totally out of control, and in order to stem the losses, the king fired Marmont and ordered the garrison to withdraw from the city, turning a false retreat into a real one. The protesters had captured Paris. The whole thing only took 3 days.
Wow, that's insane.
Old man Talleyrand, who had lost faith in the king and had been helping to guide the liberal opposition from behind the scenes, was perhaps the first person to fully understand the significance of this, as he
Friggin' Talleyrand, bro. He's always all over the place, man. You never know with Talleyrand, I feel like. He's always, like, doing something, right? Always joining. He really does jump wherever, I feel like. Yeah, watching Talleyrand always kind of shift allegiances. The man, I'll give it to Talleyrand. He's intelligent, he can keep himself afloat, and the fact he managed to make it through multiple governments and still kind of like find ways to like undermine them is just kind of amazing. Like, the man, Talleyrand's such an interesting guy, I think. A very interesting man. Someone should do a video about him. Like, I would really like to see his journey through all of this, because that's just interesting, you know?
and his political allies watched the soldiers leaving the city. He took out his pocket watch and declared, 29th of July, 5 minutes past midday. The elder branch of the House of Bourbon has ceased to reign. The liberal opposition was blown away at their own success. They had been fighting to overturn the 4 ordinances and squeeze some political concessions out of the king. And now, without even really intending to do so, they had overthrown the monarchy. That evening, the king finally tried to negotiate. If he had done that yesterday when Marmont asked him to, it may have helped. But now it was too late. The liberals controlled Paris, and they got to decide what happened next.
Celebrate May the 4th.
The next day, the liberals and their Republican allies were locked in a heated internal debate. Some argued for using their new position to overthrow the entire system, while others urged caution. The other great powers were monitoring the situation in France carefully, and if they caught even a whiff of something resembling the French Revolution, most of them were prepared to march into France to stop it.
Again, Napoleon gave everyone PTSD. The revolution gave all of Europe PTSD. Like, you have to be cautious. We can't have another revolution. You're gonna form the 20th coalition to march on Paris. You know?
That's how you get a world war. As if to drive this point home, as the liberal opposition gathered to debate their next move, they could hear cries of "Long live Napoleon" coming from the streets. The people were in a dangerous mood. They seemed fully prepared to do the whole French Revolution over again. Although it must be said that the crowd was a little misguided in their sloganeering. Napoleon was dead. He wasn't long living nothing. The liberals finally figured out what their demands would be. They demanded that King Charles be removed from power and that France transition to a limited constitutional monarchy, kind of modeled after Great Britain. This, they believed, would be just radical enough to satisfy the Republicans and prevent a civil war, but not so radical that it would freak out the other great powers and trigger a world war. The problem was figuring out who to replace the king with. Some of the more radical Republicans
His cousin? Like the guy mentioned earlier?
suggested Napoleon's 19-year-old son, but that idea was dismissed out of hand. Remember, they were trying to not freak out the other great powers. Others suggested the king's 9-year-old grandson, Henry, or Henri, I guess. But the mainstream liberals rejected this over fears that the tyrant King Charles would continue to wield power from behind the scenes. They settled on the one person that they could all agree on, the king's 56-year-old cousin, Louis-Philippe. The liberal politicians, by far the largest part of the coalition of opposition groups, strongly favored Louis-Philippe, as it was widely known that he was a closet liberal. The more conservative members of the group felt that they could hold their noses and back Louis-Philippe, since they could rest easy knowing that the monarchy would survive. The radical Republicans, who were initially pushing for Napoleon's son, also felt that they could hold their noses and get behind Louis-Philippe. What made Louis-Philippe unique was that he had fought with distinction in the Republican army. That was a big deal to the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. He may have been royalty, but in a way he was one of them.
Dude, Louis-Philippe's PR is amazing. He won everyone over. They're like, heck yeah. Louis-Philippe, man, like, he's the man of the people. All the people, you know?
It was also noteworthy to the veterans that even after circumstances forced him to flee France, Louis-Philippe never took up arms against his own country. Many exiled aristocrats did, but Louis-Philippe always refused. That was a big deal. So it seemed that Louis-Philippe was the only candidate for king that could unite the liberal, conservative, and Republican factions and prevent a civil war, at least for now. By the evening of July 30th, Louis-Philippe was on his way to Paris. It wasn't official yet, but the reign of King Charles X was effectively over. When Louis-Philippe entered Paris, he was greeted with cries of "Long live the Republic!" This was a bit of a problem. The people of Paris had been radicalized by the violence of the last 5 days. Yes, it had only been 5 days, and they might not be okay with the monarchy surviving at all. Louis-Philippe had to perform a difficult balancing act. He made an effort to reach out to all of Napoleon's old generals, and made sure to appear with them publicly, alongside symbols of the revolution, like the tricolor flag. He had to somehow communicate, "I am basically on your side," while also making it clear that he was not re-establishing the Republic. His outreach worked. The people of Paris rallied behind Louis-Philippe, and a couple of days later, Charles X abdicated.
Louis-Philippe's handling it well. Again, his good PR is working. For now. Like, so far. Like, I don't know what the heck goes on with France after this all is done, but so far, things are going really well.
The throne. The July Revolution was complete.
I am so tired. These long videos drain me, guys.
In 1830, France got off lucky. There should have been a civil war, but there wasn't. There should have been an invasion by France's conservative neighbors, but there wasn't. The liberals and their new king, Louis-Philippe, somehow managed to threaten.
It is amazing that they managed to accidentally get everything they want. Again, there wasn't an aim to overthrow Charles, it just happened. And the whole affair was less bloody than the first one, thank goodness. The first revolution was a mess. A bloodbath, if you would. This one, by comparison, was great, you know? So yeah, that's just like... it all kind of like worked out. Well, I'm gonna hold back. I'm gonna retract that statement. I don't know what the heck goes on after this. I'm not sure if Historia Civilis is even gonna continue at this point in history. We'll see, but because I think this is his most recent video too. But I will say, all around things are going well for Louis-Philippe and the conservatives, and a much less bloody revolution.
Thread the needle and preserve the peace. Austria was quick to recognize the new government in France. Metternich had been busy behind the scenes, reassuring the great powers that Louis-Philippe would be a perfectly acceptable king. And with him in charge, they had no reason to worry about the July Revolution spinning out of control. He was right. On August 3rd, Louis-Philippe reopened the legislature and proposed a set of liberal reforms, including eliminating the loophole in Article 14 of the Charter that allowed the king to seize power in the name of security. All of these reforms were popular and they passed easily.
Wow.
The old charter had stated that the king...
Suddenly everything's just flowing smoothly, huh? But I guess it helps having someone who not only sees this in the same way as you do, but someone you kind of like. So I guess it goes to show, right, how things are going.
Was the sole source of sovereignty. Now, sovereignty was shared between the king and the legislature. Politicians could now write their own legislation without first getting the approval of the king. Ministers were still approved by the king, but now they could be removed by the legislature. The old censorship law was scrapped. The size of the electorate was increased by 75%. It wasn't what Republicans would have asked for. The only people allowed to vote were still a small, wealthy minority, but it was a step in the right direction. (1830) was a turning point for Europe. The liberals pulled off a relatively bloodless revolution in France, but it was also part of a wider trend in Europe of liberals finally rising up against the authoritarian status quo.
What did they say? It was in the 1848 video by Epic History, when France sneezes, the world holds its breath, or the rest of Europe holds its breath, something like that. You know what I mean, for you fellow history buffs, but that kind of, it rings true. Like, when the French do something, it kind of affects everyone, whether they intended or not, you know?
Portugal, Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, Northern Italy, the German Confederation, and Poland all saw liberal uprisings of some kind. Some were successful, some were not, but the larger point is that the post-war conservative order was crumbling, and a new period of liberal ascendancy was beginning. The liberal victories brought about a profound change in the political left in Europe. Before 1830, the moderate liberals and the radical republicans were united in their opposition to the conservatives in power. As the liberals came to power in France and elsewhere, it exposed rifts in their coalition. In the words of Eric Hobsbawm, after 1830, liberalism and democracy appeared to be adversaries rather than allies. Alexis de Tocqueville was a big-time defender of liberal France in the 1830s and viewed the Republican left with a lot of suspicion. He wrote of the split, quote, "From the 18th century there flows two rivers. One carries men to free institutions, the other to absolute power. Liberalism, in his view, brought with it free institutions. Republicanism, in his view, brought with it mob rule and chaos, which naturally led, in his view, to absolute power and emperors." Not only did 1830 split the liberals and the Republicans, but it also split the East and the West. Liberalism triumphed over authoritarianism in France, Britain, and Belgium, which meant that Western Europe became a sort of liberal bloc. Portugal and Spain were doing their own thing, but they were so weak and consumed with internal conflict that they couldn't challenge their liberal neighbors. Eastern Europe had mostly suppressed their liberal revolts, making them a kind of conservative bloc, where monarchies continued to dominate political life.
If you're a web designer, here are 4...
That was very interesting, I think, learning about, you know, this division, this political division, just how the Republicans and the Liberals have kind of, because up to this point in the video, they seemed really closely linked to one another, but it seems like there is a separation now, which is interesting to see. And obviously I do know of modern day, you know, being liberal and being Republican, you know what I mean, a bit more different-ish, but it's cool seeing that kind of like separation there, and just seeing how Europe is divided by two, in a sense, between the conservatives and the liberals. I don't know, I just think that's really interesting you see this.
The interesting thing about France in 1830 is that it provides a sobering example of what happens when conservative governments try to freeze out even incremental progress and liberal institutions. This all could have been avoided if, at any time during the preceding 10 years, France had just allowed the liberals to win an election.
Yeah, one compromise, even the bare minimum, could have saved Charles, right? But he was so too stubborn. He brought it all on himself.
What elections are, they're release valves. If the liberals in France could have got into government and passed some reforms, it would have let off enough steam to avoid the July Revolution. But instead of doing that, the French ultra-conservatives in the 1820s sabotaged all of the release valves in order to suit their own short-term political aims. Demand for reform reached such intensity that the liberals were willing to do anything in order to achieve it. As a result, the king was overthrown, and the ultra-conservatives were swept out of power in France forever. The ultra-conservatives were so hell-bent on preventing any liberal reforms whatsoever that they lost everything. The same factors that produced the July Revolution in France were at work all across Europe. Some governments were overthrown, some were not, but every government had to figure out how to weather the same storm. No country did a better job at weathering the storm than Britain. Why? Because unlike so many of their peer nations, Britain decided to allow their disputes to be resolved through politics. The election of 1830, which was coincidentally called on the same day that the French liberals captured Paris, unleashed the greatest period of legislative productivity in Britain in 100 years. The British liberals accomplished some great things, including something that up until now was thought to be impossible. Something that would change the world forever. They abolished slavery in the British Empire.
Heck yeah. I'm assuming that's gonna be, if he comes back, well, obviously he's not gone, but you know what I mean, he's working, but I'm assuming that's gonna be the next video, and when it does drop, I'll be there. I'm tired, guys. I do not have the endurance for long videos, that's why, like, because I get tired easily, especially my voice. If you notice, I drink like 3 bottles of water in this video. Like, I do this all the time in long videos, because I'm not gonna lie, yeah. I do not have a streamer's endurance. But I'm hoping to build it up the longer this channel goes on. So, I'm gonna end the video here. I think I've said all I need to say. Bye, everyone.